The tycoon imposes a single condition in exchange for forgiving the young woman's debt. She will marry me and learn to make love. If you enjoy stories like this, be sure to subscribe to this channel. We post daily. Continuing. The last rays of the sun beat down on the cracked earth of the Texas Panhandle. Caroline Miller watched from the window of the small brick house the expanse of parched land that had once been productive. At 23, she carried on her shoulders the weight of a family on the brink of collapse. Her young face, framed by dark curls, held a determined expression that concealed the growing despair within her chest. The small Miller homestead, an inheritance spanning 3 generations, was about to disappear. The relentless drought of the past 2 years had devastated the corn and wheat crops. Debts to the bank accumulated in yellowed notices on the kitchen table, and, as if that weren't enough, her father, Anthony, was wasting away in the back room, consumed by a cancer that advanced silently, without access to the treatment that could save him. Caroline adjusted her simple skirt and returned to the room where her father rested. His face, once vigorous and marked by work on the land, now resembled a wax mask, pale and fragile. He slept a restless sleep, interrupted by coughing fits. The young woman moistened his lips with a wet cloth and held his wrinkled hand in hers. "I won't let us lose everything, Father. I promise." The next day, Caroline traveled the 15 miles to Amarillo, Texas, on the old motorcycle that still ran. She visited the bank manager for the 3rd time that week, carrying an envelope with her mother's last jewels, her mother having passed away 5 years prior. It wasn't enough. She sought out old buyers of the farm's produce, but no one dared to invest in dry land. Even the local pastor, who had always helped the community in difficult times, only offered prayers. The parish also suffered from scarcity. Returning home late in the afternoon, Caroline found a luxury car parked in the yard. The black, imposing vehicle looked like an alien creature amidst the rustic simplicity of the property. Even before dismounting her motorcycle, she felt her heart race. She knew that car. It belonged to Henry Alistair, the most powerful man in the region. Henry wasn't just a rancher, he was an empire. His lands stretched for endless acres. His companies dominated agribusiness in the Red River Valley, and his ventures spread from Dallas to New York City. At 42 he was feared and respected in equal measure. They said he had the coldness of great predators and a sharp eye for opportunities. Born into a traditional family, he had multiplied his inherited fortune through methods many considered ruthless. Caroline found him in the living room, seated on a simple wooden chair that seemed too small for his presence. He didn't smile. His dark, impeccably tailored suit contrasted with the peeling walls. His upright posture and penetrating gaze made him seem even taller than his nearly 6 feet and 3 inches. "Miss Miller," he said, rising as she entered. His voice was deep, controlled, as if he measured every word. "I've come to personally address the situation of your property." Caroline remained standing, her hands slightly trembling. "The lands are not for sale, Mr. Alistair." A hint of a smile crossed the man's angular face. "Everyone has their price, miss, especially when alternatives run out." He walked to the window, observing the property with calculating eyes. "Your father needs treatment in New York City. Your lands need investment to become productive again. And the bank—" He paused dramatically. "The bank transferred the rights to your debts to me yesterday." Caroline felt her blood run cold. Now she understood. Henry had bought her debts. She no longer needed to negotiate with the bank. Now she owed him directly. "Why?" she asked, her voice firmer than she expected. "Say us these lands aren't worth that much to someone like you, sir." Henry turned slowly. The evening light cast shadows across his face, highlighting his striking features, and a gaze that seemed to see beyond the surface. "I have a proposal different from what you imagine, Miss Miller." They sat at the kitchen table. Caroline served simple coffee in plain mugs, which seemed embarrassing in front of a man accustomed to fine china. Henry didn't touch the drink. "I need a wife," he said without preamble. "Not for love or companionship. I need someone who will lend legitimacy to my public image, someone who can accompany me to events, who knows how to behave with discretion, and who has no romantic expectations." Caroline felt the air escape her lungs. The proposal was so unexpected that for a few seconds she thought she had misunderstood. "Are you proposing marriage to me?" "A contract," he corrected. In return, I will pay your debts, guarantee the best treatment for your father in New York City, and invest enough to restore the productivity of these lands. Your family will be safe." The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Caroline searched for words that wouldn't come. Why me? There are women from influential families who would accept. I don't want political or social connections. I want someone who understands the value of what I'm offering, who has real reasons to honor the agreement. Furthermore, he studied her with a calculating gaze, you have sufficient education, natural poise, and a discreet beauty that doesn't attract unwanted attention. The coldness with which he evaluated her was disconcerting. Caroline felt like merchandise being inspected. And what would be my obligations? Henry rested his hands on the table, his fingers long and firm, marked by work despite his wealth. Accompany me to events when requested. Maintain absolute discretion about our personal arrangements. Manage the main house on the Alistair Ranch. And, he paused almost imperceptibly, share my bed. You will marry me and learn to make love. The last words fell like stones in Caroline's stomach. She wasn't naive, she knew what marriage entailed. But the direct, almost clinical way Henry approached the matter made it all the more intimidating. "Do I need time to think?" she managed to say, her voice slightly trembling. "You have until tomorrow," he replied, standing up. "The bank has scheduled the land auction for next week, and your father needs to start treatment as soon as possible." That night, Caroline didn't sleep. Sitting on the porch of the house, she watched the stars in the clear Texas panhandle sky, searching for answers that wouldn't come. Henry's proposal was a prison, but also the only chance to save her family. She thought of her father, of the lands that represented her ancestors, history, of the dreams she had built for her life. None of this would be possible without accepting the contract offered by the rancher. The next morning, when Henry's car parked in the yard again, Caroline was already waiting for him. She wore the best she had, a simple blue skirt and a white blouse, her hair pulled back in a low bun. She looked older, more resolute. "I accept your proposal," she said. Even before he had fully exited the vehicle, Henry nodded, as if he had never doubted her answer. "The contract is in the car. We'll sign it now." Without witnesses other than the driver, who remained at a respectful distance, Caroline signed the document that would change her life forever. There was no romance, no empty promises. It was a business deal, sealed with ink on paper. "The ceremony will be next Saturday in the ranch chapel. Only what's necessary to make it official," Henry informed her. "A driver will pick you up on Friday. Bring only the essentials. I will provide the rest." He hesitated for an instant, as if he were about to say something more, but he merely extended his hand for a formal handshake, which Caroline accepted with an almost imperceptible tremor. 3 days later, her father embarked for New York City, accompanied by a nurse hired by Henry. The treatment was already scheduled at one of the country's best oncology hospitals. Caroline hugged him tightly at their farewell. "I don't understand why he's doing this, daughter," the debilitated man murmured. "Be careful. Everything will be fine, father. Just focus on getting better." On Friday, as agreed, a driver arrived to pick her up. Caroline entered the luxury car, carrying only a small suitcase with simple clothes and a few personal items. A family photograph, her mother's rosary, and a book of poetry that had accompanied her since adolescence. The Alistair Ranch was a world apart. Located about 30 miles from Amarillo, Texas, it stretched for acres of irrigated land, a green oasis amidst the aridity of the plains. The main house, an imposing construction that blended colonial elements with modern touches, stood atop a hill, surrounded by well-tended gardens and a swimming pool that reflected the blue sky. Caroline was greeted by Mrs. Eleanor, the housekeeper, who had managed the house for over 20 years, a middle-aged woman with an austere face and vigilant eyes, who evaluated her from head to toe with poorly disguised suspicion. "Mr. Henry has determined that you will stay in the master bedroom," she informed her, leading Caroline through corridors decorated with noble wood furniture and works of art. "Your new clothes are already in the closets. If you need anything, just call one of the maids." The bedroom was larger than the entire house where Caroline had grown up. Decorated in shades of blue and white, it had a king-size bed in the center, ample wardrobes, and a balcony overlooking vineyards that stretched to the horizon. A side door led to a marble bathroom, with a bathtub and double shower, Mrs. Eleanor left her alone without further explanation. Caroline opened the closets and found dozens of new items, dresses, pants, blouses, all from expensive brands and in sizes precisely fitted for her. There was also a selection of fine and delicate lingerie, which made her blush as she imagined how Henry knew her exact measurements. She took a long bath and chose a simple dress from among the new ones. When she went out to explore the house, she noticed curious glances and whispers from the staff she encountered. It was evident that everyone knew who she was and why she was there. Some looked with pity, others with poorly disguised disdain. Dinner was served promptly at 8 in a formal dining room with a table for 12. Caroline sat at one end, feeling small and out of place. Henry arrived punctually, wearing dress pants and a white shirt. He sat at the other end of the table, creating a physical distance that symbolized the abyss between their worlds. "I hope you found everything in order," he said, as the servants served the appetizer. "Yes, thank you," Caroline replied, trying to maintain her composure. Conversation during dinner was minimal and superficial. Henry asked if she needed anything, informed her about her father's health. Stable, responding well to the initial tests, and briefly commented on the next day's ceremony. "It will be at 10 in the morning, in the chapel. The priest has already been informed. There will only be a few essential staff as witnesses." Caroline nodded, unable to formulate a reply. The reality of what was about to happen weighed increasingly heavily on her shoulders. After dinner, Henry accompanied her to her room. He stopped at the door, maintaining a respectful distance. "Rest. Tomorrow will be an important day." For a moment, Caroline thought he would enter the room, that he would claim his contractual rights even before the ceremony. But Henry merely gave a slight nod and walked away down the corridor. The ranch chapel was a simple and elegant construction, with stained glass windows that filtered sunlight into colorful beams. There were no flowers, music, or special decorations. Caroline wore a simple, straight-cut white dress she had found in the closet, along with a note from Mrs. Eleanor. For the ceremony, Henry awaited her at the altar, wearing a dark grey suit. His face showed no emotion, neither happiness nor regret, just the same controlled expression as always. The priest, an elderly man who seemed slightly uncomfortable with the situation, conducted a brief and direct ceremony. The vows were traditional, pronounced with a firm voice by Henry, and almost inaudibly by Caroline. When the priest declared them husband and wife, Henry leaned in and placed a chaste kiss on her lips, their first physical contact. It was a brief touch, without passion or tenderness, merely the fulfillment of a formality. There was no reception or celebration. After the ceremony, Henry had urgent business to attend to. Leaving Caroline alone in the main house, she spent the rest of the day wandering through the rooms, feeling like an intruder in her new home. The staff maintained a respectful distance, but their glances conveyed curiosity and, in some cases, poorly disguised disdain. During dinner, again formal and silent, Henry informed her that he would need to travel to New York City the following week. "I will take the opportunity to personally check on your father's treatment," he said, with a neutral tone that didn't reveal whether he was doing a favor or fulfilling a contractual obligation. "Thank you," Caroline replied, lowering her eyes to her plate. "May I write a letter for him?" Henry nodded. A heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the clinking of cutlery. When they finished dessert, Henry stood up and extended his hand to her, a gesture that surprised her. "Come." Caroline felt her heart race. She knew what was coming next. It was their wedding night, a night that, under other circumstances, should have been one of intimacy and discovery between two people in love. Instead, she felt she was walking towards the fulfillment of yet another contractual clause. As they entered the bedroom, Henry closed the door and stood still for a few moments, observing her. His gaze had changed. It was no longer cold and calculating, but intense, with a glint that Caroline couldn't decipher. "You can use the bathroom first," he said, with unexpected gentleness. Caroline nodded, taking a silk nightgown from the closet, white and elegant, but without the vulgarity she had feared to find. In the bathroom, she took a long bath, trying to calm her nerves. She looked at herself in the mirror, her face flushed with anxiety, her dark eyes revealing the fear she tried to hide. "It's just a contract," she whispered to herself. "You're doing this for your family." When she emerged, Henry was sitting on the edge of the bed, already without his jacket and tie, the first buttons of his shirt undone. He stood up when he saw her, his eyes slowly scanning her body, covered by the nightgown. "You are much more beautiful than you appear at first glance," he said, his voice lower and hoarser than usual. Caroline didn't know how to respond. She stood still, her trembling hands holding the robe that covered her nightgown, expecting the worst. Humiliation, the brutality she feared. Henry approached slowly. He raised his hand and touched her face with surprising delicacy, his fingers tracing the curve of her jaw. Then, with deliberately slow gestures, he untied her robe, sliding it from her shoulders until it fell to the floor. "Don't be afraid," he murmured. "I won't hurt you." The first kiss was soft, almost hesitant, so different from the coldness he had shown until then. Henry's lips were firm yet gentle, exploring hers with a patience Caroline hadn't expected. His large hands held her face with a delicacy that contrasted with his imposing appearance. He guided her to the bed, sitting beside her. He continued kissing her, now with more intensity, but without haste. His hands moved over her arms, then her shoulders, her back, always with firm yet respectful touches. "You've never—" He hesitated, his questioning gaze meeting hers. Caroline shook her head negatively, the blush intensifying on her face. It was true. She had never been with a man before. In the small community where she had grown up, courtships were few and chaste, watched by the vigilant eyes of the neighborhood. Henry nodded, an indescribable expression crossing his face. "Let's take it slow, then." What followed was a gentle and patient initiation. Henry guided her with soft words and firm touches, teaching her without humiliating her. His experience was evident, but there was no arrogance in his gestures, just a quiet determination to make her feel pleasure. When they finally united, Caroline felt pain, as she expected. But Henry waited for her to adjust, watching her face with attention, kissing her tears when they escaped. And then, when the initial discomfort passed, he led her to sensations she had never imagined possible. Her body responded in ways that surprised her, as if awakening from a long sleep. After the climax, which came first for her and then for him, Henry didn't immediately pull away. He held her in his arms for some time, his fingers tracing distracted patterns on her back. There were no declarations of love or empty promises, just a silence that, for the first time, didn't feel oppressive. When he finally rolled to his side, Henry surprised her again by pulling her close, settling her against his chest. Caroline's heart was confused. Part of her wanted to hate him for turning her into merchandise, for buying her life with a cold contract. Another part was grateful for the unexpected gentleness, for the care he had shown in a moment that could have been just another humiliation. "Sleep," he whispered, his voice rough with sleep. "Try tomorrow will be a new day." Caroline closed her eyes, physically and emotionally exhausted. Her last thought before falling asleep was that, while her body had surrendered to Henry's teachings, her soul was entering a silent war between gratitude and revolt, between acceptance and resistance. A war that was just beginning. Over the following days, Caroline discovered that the routine at Alistair Ranch followed its own rhythm, independent of her presence. Henry left early to oversee business, returning only for dinner. Meals continued to be times of sparse conversation, though he occasionally asked about her day or shared some business information. Nights, however, were different. In the bedroom, Henry transformed, not into a passionate man, but into an attentive and patient lover. He taught her about her own body with a mix of authority and gentleness that left her confused. Why did he show such consideration in intimacy, while maintaining such distance during the day? Solitude weighed heavily on Caroline. The household staff, following Mrs. Eleanor's example, treated her with a distant formality. It wasn't declared hostility, but the message was clear. She didn't belong there. She wasn't truly an Alistair. It was during a particularly lonely afternoon that Caroline discovered the house's library, hidden in an older wing of the mansion. It was a spacious room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, packed with books of all kinds. There were everything from literary classics to technical volumes on agriculture, economics, and administration. A space that, judging by the accumulation of dust in some corners, seemed little frequented. There, among yellowed pages and the comforting scent of old paper, Caroline found refuge. She spent hours exploring the volumes, discovering authors she had never known, delving into stories that transported her far from her confined reality. It was also in the library that she found the ranch's accounting ledgers, thick, leather-bound volumes meticulously organized by year. Driven by curiosity and a desire to better understand her husband's empire, she began to leaf through them. To her surprise, she discovered she had a knack for numbers. In school, she had always been good at math, but she had never imagined it could be a real talent. As she delved into the financial records, she began to see patterns, identify inefficiencies, and imagine solutions. One afternoon, absorbed in the accounting ledgers, she didn't notice Henry's presence until he spoke, startling her. "What are you doing?" Caroline stood up quickly, as if she had been caught in a transgression. I was just reading. I'm sorry if I shouldn't have." Henry approached, observing the open books on the table. His face didn't reveal if he was annoyed or merely curious. "Do you understand accounting?" "Not formally," she replied, regaining her composure, "but I've always had a knack for numbers, and I noticed some interesting things in last year's records." One of Henry's eyebrows rose, a sign of interest that she was beginning to recognize. "What things?" Hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, Caroline explained her observation about how irrigation costs had disproportionately increased in a specific area of the ranch, suggesting a possible leak or inefficiency in the system. Henry listened in silence, his face impenetrable. When she finished, he continued to look at her for a few moments, as if seeing her for the first time. "Interesting," he finally said. "I'll check on that tomorrow." That night, during dinner, Henry broke the pattern of silence. "You were right," he said, surprising her. "There was a problem in the North Sector's irrigation system. We'll save thousands of dollars a month with the repair." Caroline felt an unexpected warmth in her chest, a feeling of pride and satisfaction she hadn't experienced in a long time. "I'm glad I could help," she replied, allowing herself a small smile. Henry studied her for a few moments, his dark eyes revealing a glint of curiosity. "Jazz, where did you learn to analyze numbers like that?" "In school, I suppose. I always liked math, and on our small homestead, I was the one who helped my father with the accounts." Henry nodded, thoughtful. Then, in a gesture that caught her completely off guard, he reached across the table and briefly touched her hand. "Perhaps we can find a use for that talent of yours." That casual touch, the first public gesture of recognition he had shown, marked the beginning of a subtle transformation. In the following days, Henry began to leave financial reports on her bedside table, without explanation. Caroline read them, made notes, highlighted points that caught her attention. During dinner, he occasionally asked for her opinion on some aspect of the business. At first, she responded timidly, fearing to appear presumptuous, but with each conversation, she gained more confidence, realizing that he truly listened to her observations. Their hands, which previously would withdraw after meals, now occasionally met in brief touches. Their words, still sparse, became less formal, and at night, intimacy gained more complex nuances, not just physical, but with moments of real conversation, when Henry, exhausted after a day's work, shared fragments of his thoughts before falling asleep. One night, Caroline woke up and found him watching her in the dim light. His eyes, normally guarded by a wall of self-control, seemed vulnerable in the darkness. "What is it?" she asked, her voice rough with sleep. "Nothing," he replied, looking away, but his hand caressed her face with a delicacy that spoke more than words. "Go back to sleep." The next morning, Caroline found a book on her bedside table, a novel she had mentioned wanting to read during one of their rare conversations. There was no note, no mention of the gift during breakfast, but that silent gesture said something that Henry's words still couldn't express. The ice barrier was beginning very slowly to melt. A month had passed since the wedding. The Allister ranch now breathed a slightly different air. The staff, who had previously avoided Caroline, began to greet her with discreet nods. Mrs. Eleanor, always rigid, occasionally asked for her opinion on the menu or the organization of an event on the property. It was as if the house, slowly, was accepting her. Henry began to call Caroline to meetings with managers and administrators. At first, she merely observed, sitting discreetly in a corner of the room. But over time, he began to ask for her opinion directly, surprising both her and the older staff. Some faces showed evident discomfort when Henry valued his young wife's suggestions on financial or administrative matters. "She has a fresh perspective on problems," Henry explained once, when one of the managers indirectly questioned her presence. "And a natural intuition for numbers that many trained accountants don't possess." That public compliment, spoken with the naturalness of someone stating a fact, brought a blush to Caroline's face that she couldn't hide. It wasn't just professional recognition, it was the way Henry had looked at her when saying those words, a gaze that contained something beyond his usual coldness. The nights also changed. Physical intimacy, previously a territory of discovery controlled by Henry, became a dialogue between bodies learning to communicate. Caroline was no longer just a student, she became an active participant, surprising him with initiatives that made his eyes darken with desire. One morning, after a particularly intense night, Caroline noticed a book of poems discreetly left beside her pillow, open to a marked page. It was a sonnet by Pablo Neruda, underlined on a line that read, "I love you," without knowing how or when or from where. There was no dedication, nor any mention of the book during breakfast, but that silent gesture made her heart race with an emotion she didn't yet dare to name. The most significant change, however, came when Henry announced he would take her on a trip to New York City. "We'll visit your father at the hospital," he said during dinner. "And then we'll attend an important event, the launch of the Alistair Winery's new line of wines." Caroline felt a mix of joy at the prospect of seeing her father and apprehension about the social event. "I don't have suitable clothes for a launch of that magnitude," she confessed. An almost imperceptible smile touched Henry's lips. "Yes, that's easily resolved." The next day, a personal stylist arrived at the ranch with a selection of designer dresses, shoes, and accessories. Caroline, accustomed to simplicity, felt out of place amidst so many luxuries. But the professional, an elegant middle-aged woman, reassured her with kindness. "Mr. Alistair asked us to find pieces that would enhance your natural beauty without exaggeration," she explained. "He specifically mentioned that he didn't want to transform you into something you are not." That unexpected consideration touched Caroline deeply. Henry could have dressed her like a trophy, covered in jewels and excesses for public display. Instead, he respected her essence. The trip to New York City was revealing in many aspects. The reunion with her father, now settled in a comfortable apartment near the hospital, showed Caroline how much her decision had been worth it. Anthony Miller, still frail but visibly better, hugged her with tears in his eyes. "You're different, daughter," he said, studying her with an attentive gaze. "There's a new light in your eyes." Caroline smiled, uncertain how to explain the transformations occurring within her. How could she tell her father that the marriage of convenience was beginning to become something more complex, that the man who had bought her life with a cold contract now looked at her in ways that made her heart stumble? Henry remained respectfully distant during the visit, allowing privacy between father and daughter. Only at the end did he approach for a formal conversation with Mr. Miller about the progress of the treatment and the next steps. "Your daughter has been a great partner," Henry said, with a naturalness that surprised Caroline. "Though her business intuition is impressive." The look Anthony cast at his daughter contained a silent question she couldn't answer. Was there more to those words than a simple professional observation? The winery event, held in one of New York City's most luxurious hotels, was completely new territory for Caroline. Dressed in an elegant midnight blue gown that flattered her discreet curves without vulgarity, she felt like an actress playing a role. Important businessmen, influential politicians, celebrities, a world far removed from everything she had known until then. To her surprise, Henry didn't leave her alone for a moment. He kept her by his side, introducing her with evident pride. "My wife, Caroline," he would say, his hand occasionally resting on her back in a protective gesture. That "my wife" sounded different now, not like the assertion of ownership she had feared at first, but like something that carried a new layer of meaning. Throughout the evening, several guests approached her with poorly disguised curiosity. The new Mrs. Alistair was a mystery in social circles. Where had she come from? How had she won over one of the most coveted bachelors in American agribusiness? Caroline navigated the conversations with a natural dignity that impressed even Henry. She didn't try to feign a sophistication she didn't possess, but neither was she intimidated. She spoke sincerely about her simple origins, avoiding details that might sound like gossip, and demonstrated genuine business knowledge when the subject arose. "You were extraordinary," Henry commented in the hotel elevator when they were finally alone. His eyes held a sparkle Caroline had never seen before, a mix of admiration and something deeper that made her heart race. That night, the intimacy between them transcended the physical. There was a new urgency in Henry's touches, a vulnerability in his kisses that spoke of feelings not yet expressed in words. And afterward, as they rested in the dim light of the hotel room, he held her firmly in his arms, as if fearing she might disappear. The next morning, Caroline woke up alone in the bed. She found Henry on the suite's balcony, observing the city awakening 15 floors below. Wearing only pajama bottoms, with his dark hair disheveled and unshaven, he looked younger, more approachable. "Good morning," she said, approaching hesitantly. Henry turned, and something in his gaze made Caroline stop. There was an intensity there, a visible internal struggle. "What are you doing to me, Caroline?" he asked, his voice low and hoarse. "I don't understand." "Neither do I," he confessed, running a hand through his hair in an uncharacteristic gesture of nervousness. This was supposed to be just a contract, practical, controlled. Caroline felt her heart race. It was the first time Henry had spoken openly about what was happening between them. "And it isn't anymore," she dared to ask. Henry took a step towards her, his eyes fixed on hers with an almost painful intensity. "You know it's not." Before they could continue that potentially transformative conversation, the phone rang. It was from the hotel reception. A business emergency required Henry's immediate presence. The moment of vulnerability evaporated, the mask of the ruthless businessman returning to its place. "We'll continue this conversation at home," he said, already heading to the bathroom. But the conversation didn't happen. Back at the ranch, Henry plunged into a crisis that demanded all his attention. Export problems, political issues affecting agribusiness, endless meetings. For days, Caroline barely saw him, except for brief moments during meals when he seemed too exhausted for any deep dialogue. Life ran its course. Caroline, increasingly involved in the ranch's administration, discovered an unexpected satisfaction in applying her natural intelligence to concrete problems. Henry entrusted her with increasing responsibilities, and she responded with results that impressed even the most skeptical employees. It was during this period that Caroline developed a special interest in the ranch's horses. Henry owned a respected breeding program of American quarter horses, a prestigious American breed. Initially intimidated by the imposing animals, Caroline gradually drew closer, encouraged by the trainer, an experienced gentleman who recognized in her a natural affinity with horses. She learned to ride, first with hesitation, then with growing confidence. Morning rides became her favorite part of the day. The freedom of galloping through the ranch's extensive fields brought a sense of control over her own life that she hadn't experienced in a long time. Henry observed this new passion with silent approval. One morning, he surprised her with a gift, a young mare, with a chestnut coat and gentle temperament. "She reminds me of you," he said, as Caroline caressed the animal's neck with evident enchantment. Apparently docile, but with strength and determination in her eyes. The gesture touched Caroline deeply. It wasn't just a luxurious gift, it was a recognition of who she was, of what she was becoming in that new life. Weeks turned into months. The relationship between Caroline and Henry evolved in a silent dance of approaches and retreats. There were moments of deep connection, nighttime conversations about childhood dreams, shared laughter over everyday situations, the growing comfort of waking up in each other's arms. But barriers also persisted. Subjects Henry refused to discuss, aspects of his past he kept locked away, the evident difficulty he had in expressing feelings directly. It was on a Sunday morning during a solitary ride that everything changed. Caroline, confident in her newly acquired skills, took her mare on a more challenging path in the hills surrounding the property. The animal was startled by a snake that crossed its path, reared violently, and Caroline, caught by surprise, was thrown to the ground. The fall was severe. Her head hit a rock, and for a few seconds everything went dark. When she regained consciousness, she felt intense pain in her shoulder and realized she couldn't get up. The mare had disappeared, likely returning to the stable. Caroline tried to scream for help, but she was too far away to be heard. The strong sun of the plains beat down, and the pain began to make her dizzy. She lost track of time, alternating between moments of lucidity and semi-consciousness. She didn't know how much time had passed until she heard the distant sound of hooves. Then urgent voices, and finally, strong arms that lifted her with extreme care. "Caroline, speak to me!" Henry's voice sounded unrecognizable, choked with panic, stripped of its usual composure. His eyes, when she managed to focus on them, were wild with worry. "I'm fine," she managed to murmur, despite the throbbing pain. "Just my shoulder." "Don't speak. Save your strength," he ordered, but without his customary coldness, just desperate urgency. Caroline was carried to the main house and immediately examined by the family doctor, who diagnosed a mild concussion and a dislocated shoulder. After the painful procedure to reset the joint, she received medication that left her drowsy and confused. During the days that followed, she saw a side of Henry she had never imagined existed. He cancelled all appointments, delegated urgent responsibilities, and practically didn't leave the room. He sat beside the bed for hours, holding her hand while she slept under the effect of the painkillers. When she woke, he offered water, helped her eat, personally checked that the medications were being administered correctly. At night, Henry read to her, not reports or business documents, but poetry and novels he found in the library. His deep voice, normally used for giving orders or closing deals, now flowed softly in verses of love and narratives of overcoming. In a moment of lucidity, Caroline watched him as he slept, uncomfortably settled in the armchair beside the bed. He had abandoned his impeccable suits for simple clothes, his grown beard giving him a vulnerable air that contrasted with his public image. At that moment, he wasn't the powerful businessman, the man feared and respected throughout the region. He was just someone consumed by worry. One night, when the fever that followed the fall finally subsided, Caroline woke up with a feeling of dampness on her hand. She opened her eyes and saw Henry bent over the bed, holding her fingers in his, silent tears wetting her skin. "Henry?" she called, her voice weak. He raised his face without trying to hide his emotion, something he had never done before. "I thought I was going to lose you," he said, with a raw honesty that broke her last defenses. "I'm here." "I couldn't bear it," he continued, the words coming out as if torn from his chest. "I couldn't bear to lose you now, not after discovering that—" He hesitated, as if afraid of his own words. "Discover what?" Caroline insisted, her heart racing despite her weakness. Henry took a deep breath, a man accustomed to controlling the world around him, now struggling to control his own emotions. "That I need you," he finally confessed, "but I don't know if that's love or fear of losing you." Those words, spoken with such vulnerability, hit Caroline like a wave. It wasn't a traditional romantic declaration, but coming from a man like Henry, who had built walls around his own heart, it meant something profound. "I'm afraid too," she admitted, squeezing his hand. "Afraid of feeling something that wasn't in the contract." A sad smile touched Henry's lips. "The contract never foresaw this," he said, touching her face with delicacy. "It never foresaw that you would become necessary." Caroline's recovery marked a new phase in their relationship. As her strength returned, something fundamentally changed between them. Henry didn't directly mention his feelings again, but his actions spoke for him. The way he tried to be present during meals, how he occasionally touched her face or hair in unpretentious gestures of affection, how he seemed more willing to share thoughts and concerns. When the doctor finally authorized Caroline to resume normal activities, Henry surprised her with a proposal. "I want you to visit your father," he said during breakfast. "He's much better, and he was worried when he heard about the accident. I thought we could spend a few days in Amarillo." The mention of her hometown made Caroline raise her eyebrows, surprised. "You would come with me?" "Of course," Henry replied, naturally. "I've never properly known the place where you grew up. Besides, I have some potential business in the region." The trip to Amarillo was a revelation for both of them. The small Miller homestead, now recovered thanks to Henry's investments, prospered under the care of distant cousins who had taken over its administration. Caroline's father, significantly recovered after months of treatment, had returned to live there, albeit with a nurse who assisted him on difficult days. Seeing him standing, walking around the property with an energy that seemed impossible months ago, brought tears to Caroline's eyes. The prolonged hug they shared spoke of everything they had overcome, of sacrifices that now seemed rewarded. To Caroline's surprise, Henry showed genuine interest in the property. He spent hours talking with Mr. Miller about cultivation techniques adapted to drought, listening with respect to the experiences of a man who, though without resources or formal education, had accumulated decades of practical knowledge. "Your father is a wise man," Henry commented during a walk along the property's boundaries. "I understand where your natural intelligence comes from." The comment, spoken with genuine admiration, warmed Caroline's heart. The stay in Amarillo, however, was not without tensions. On the third day of the visit, they received a visit from Michael Owens, a local doctor, who had initially cared for Caroline's father and who had been a close family friend for years. The young doctor, charismatic and with an easy smile, showed a familiarity with Caroline that visibly bothered Henry. The shared stories about adolescence, the references to past moments, the way Michael occasionally touched her arm when emphasizing a point, all this provoked a stiffening in Henry's posture, a coldness in his gaze that Caroline recognized as dangerous. During dinner, when Michael casually mentioned that he had always known Caroline was destined for great things, that she was too talented to be stuck in that backwater, Henry's control finally broke. "And yet you did nothing to help her when her father was dying and the property was going bankrupt," he observed, with a falsely casual voice that barely disguised his hostility. An awkward silence fell over the table. Michael swallowed hard, visibly uncomfortable. "Not all of us have the resources you possess, Mr. Alistair," he replied, trying to maintain his dignity. "Resources?" Henry raised an eyebrow. "Or determination? Because it seems to me that you always admired Caroline from a distance, but never had enough courage to truly be by her side when she needed it most." "Henry, please," Caroline intervened, alarmed by the escalating tension. The rest of the dinner proceeded in a heavy atmosphere. Michael said his goodbyes right after dessert, with vague promises to visit Mr. Miller again. When they were alone, Caroline confronted Henry. "Why did you treat Michael that way? He's a friend. He always helped my family." Henry, who had been watching the night through the living room window, turned with a stormy gaze. "Friend? He looks at you the way a man looks at a woman he desires, not like a friend." The accusation caught Caroline by surprise. "That's absurd. Michael and I grew up together. We're like siblings." "He doesn't see you as a sister," Henry insisted, his voice dangerously controlled. "And I wonder if you truly see him as a brother." It was as if an invisible wall rose between them. All the closeness built in recent weeks suddenly seemed threatened. "Are you accusing me of something?" Caroline asked, her voice trembling with indignation. "I'm questioning what you truly feel," Henry replied. "If you're with me only because of the contract, for your family's security, or if there's something real." "How dare you?" Caroline's voice rose, years of repressed emotions finally finding an outlet. "I was the one bought, Henry. I was the one who gave up choices, dreams, freedom." "And I gave everything in return," he retorted, his composure finally crumbling. "I saved your father, restored your lands, offered a life you would never have had. A life I didn't ask for, a contract I signed out of desperation." Henry took a step forward, his eyes darkened by conflicting emotions. "And now, is it still just a contract for you? When you're in my arms at night, when you look at me in that way that completely disarms me, when you smile when you see me arrive, is it still just an obligation?" The question hit Caroline like a physical blow. The truth was that for a long time her actions had ceased to be motivated by the contract. When she was with Henry, truly with him, in moments of shared vulnerability. She didn't think of obligations or agreements. She felt things she never imagined possible to feel for the man who had bought her. But wounded pride and the sting of the accusation spoke louder. "You don't know how to love, Henry," she said, with a coldness she didn't know she possessed. "You only know how to possess." His face paled as if he had been slapped. For an instant, Caroline glimpsed a pain so profound in his eyes that she almost retracted her words. But it was too late. Henry left without saying anything and did not return to the room they shared at the Miller homestead. Caroline spent the night awake, alternating between anger and regret, wondering how things had derailed so quickly. The next morning, she found him on the porch, watching the sunrise. He seemed not to have slept either. When he turned to face her, his face showed the signs of a night of internal conflict. "I apologize for my behavior," he said, with a formality that hurt more than shouts. "It was inappropriate and unfair to you." Caroline approached hesitantly, still hurt, but already regretting the harshness of her own words. "I apologize too. I shouldn't have said what I said." Henry shook his head, a sad smile on his lips. "Perhaps you were right," he admitted, surprising her. "Perhaps I really don't know how to love. I never learned." There was such raw vulnerability in his confession that Caroline felt her heart clench. "What do you mean?" Henry took a deep breath, as if gathering courage for something extremely difficult. "My father was a hard man, Caroline. He built an empire from nothing, at the cost of many sacrifices and some questionable choices. I grew up watching him treat people like pieces on a chessboard, including my mother, including me. Love was a weakness in our home. Feelings were dangerous distractions." It was the first time Henry had spoken of his childhood, of his family. Caroline listened in silence, realizing how many layers still existed in this man who had seemed so simple to define at first. "I learned to control, to plan, to conquer," he continued. "I learned that power and wealth bring security, that vulnerability is a risk one cannot take in business. I applied these lessons to everything in life, including our marriage." He took a step towards her, his eyes reflecting an evident internal struggle. "But then you happened, Caroline, with your quiet strength, your natural intelligence, your ability to see beyond appearances, and everything I had learned began to crumble." The confession, so honest and stripped of defenses, touched Caroline deeply. She extended her hand, touching his face in a gesture of understanding. "No one is born knowing how to love, Henry." He covered her hand with his own, an almost desperate gesture. "I'm afraid I don't know how," he confessed, his voice low. "I'm ruining everything, of hurting you, of not being the man you deserve." Caroline felt tears in her eyes. Who could have imagined months ago that the powerful and cold Henry Alistair would be standing before her, exposing such profoundly human insecurities? "We can learn together," she whispered, "if you want to." For a long moment, Henry just watched her, as if contemplating a rare and fragile treasure. Then, his voice choked with emotion, he made the most vulnerable request a man like him could make. "Teach me how to love the right way, Caroline." Those words, spoken with such honesty and humility, broke the last barriers. Caroline approached and hugged him, feeling him tremble slightly in her arms. The Iron Man finally allowing himself to be merely human. The kiss that followed was different from all the previous ones. There was not just desire, or comfort, or habit. There was a silent promise, a new beginning, a contract very different from the one signed months ago. When they returned to Alistair Ranch the next day, both knew that nothing would be as before. What had begun as a marriage of convenience was transforming into something neither of them could have foreseen, a real partnership, born not of cold contracts, but of conscious choices, day after day. And the greatest transformation was just beginning. The months that followed Henry's confession on the porch of the Miller homestead brought changes that neither Caroline nor the oldest ranch employees could have imagined. The man who once governed his empire with calculating coldness now consulted his wife before important decisions. The woman who had entered the property as a hired stranger now led meetings, implemented projects, and was respected on her own merit. "It's as if the ranch has gained a new soul," Mrs. Eleanor once commented, having transitioned from suspicious overseer to Caroline's loyal ally. The transformation didn't happen overnight. There were stumbles, moments when Henry relapsed into old patterns of control, situations where Caroline needed to remind him, with gentle firmness, of the commitment they had made to each other. But with each passing day, the relationship evolved towards something deeper than a contract, a true partnership. Life on the ranch gained a new atmosphere. Dinners that were once silent and tense became moments of lively conversations about the day, future projects, and even occasional laughter. Nights, which had already progressed from mere physical obligation to a deeper intimacy, now brought moments of genuine tenderness, Henry learning, word by word, gesture by gesture, to express feelings he had repressed his entire life. Caroline flourished in this new environment. Her natural intelligence, now nurtured by practical and theoretical knowledge, Henry had hired private tutors to complement her education in areas of interest, transformed her into a respected and visionary manager. She implemented an education program for the children of the ranch workers, transforming an old guest house into a school that offered not only the basic curriculum, but also technical training in sustainable agriculture and administration. She reorganized the irrigation system, increasing efficiency and reducing water consumption, an innovation that soon attracted the attention of ranchers throughout the region. "You are revolutionizing the way we operate," Henry observed one evening, as they reviewed projects in their shared office. "You can see solutions that would never occur to me." "It's because I see things from another angle," Caroline replied. "I grew up on the other side of the equation. I know what it's like to be dependent on a system that doesn't always consider people's real needs." That unique perspective was precisely what made their partnership so powerful. Henry brought the experience, the resources, the market knowledge. Caroline contributed empathy, creativity, and the ability to genuinely connect with people. Together, they were building not just a relationship, but a legacy. But not everything was rosy. Caroline's transformation from the girl from the failed homestead to the respected Mrs. Alistair deeply bothered some quarters. Charles Edward Vance, the ranch foreman for over 15 years and a distant cousin of Henry's first wife, who had died in a car accident even before Caroline entered the scene, was the most vocal among the discontented. A middle-aged man, traditionalist and proud, Charles Edward had never fully accepted Caroline's presence. In the first few months, when she seemed merely an exotic acquisition of the boss, he limited himself to politely ignoring her. But as her influence grew, as her ideas were implemented and her power consolidated, his hostility became increasingly evident. Small sabotages began to occur, reports mysteriously disappearing before important meetings, equipment exhibiting inexplicable failures in projects led by Caroline. Rumors spread among workers about how the boss's wife wanted to change everything just to show authority. Caroline perceived the resistance, but chose to confront it with hard work and results rather than direct confrontation. She knew that part of the hostility came from prejudice, a young woman of humble origin occupying a position of power in a traditionally masculine universe. Another part came from personal interest. Charles Edward had always harbored hopes of becoming Henry's partner, not just an employee. The situation reached a breaking point during an important meeting with international investors interested in the sustainable agriculture project developed by Caroline. As she presented the preliminary results, Charles Edward abruptly interrupted. "With all due respect, madam," he said, emphasizing "madam" with slight disdain. "These numbers seem overly optimistic. How can someone with so little experience in the field guarantee such ambitious returns?" A tense silence fell over the meeting room. All eyes turned to Caroline, waiting to see how she would react to the public undermining. With a calm that surprised even herself, Caroline smiled slightly. "An excellent question, Mr. Vance. That's precisely why I don't rely solely on theories." She opened a folder she had kept beside her presentation. "Here are the detailed reports for each phase of the pilot project, including independent analyses conducted by the state university. The numbers are not optimistic. They are conservative in relation to the actual results we are already achieving." She passed the documentation to the investors, who examined the pages filled with data, graphs, and analyses with growing interest. As for my experience, Kwanshi continued, maintaining a professional tone despite the provocation, I believe true innovation comes precisely from fresh perspectives. Sometimes, being stuck in traditional methods prevents us from seeing obvious solutions. The investors nodded, clearly impressed not only with the presentation, but with how Caroline had handled the hostile questioning. Charles Edward, on the other hand, had a face red with humiliation. Henry, who had observed the confrontation in silence, finally intervened. If there are no further relevant questions, I suggest we continue with the presentation. The look he cast at Charles Edward contained a clear warning, but the foreman seemed far from intimidated. After the meeting, when the investors had already left with promises of partnership, Henry called Caroline to his private office. "You were extraordinary," he said, with evident pride. "Not just for the project itself, but for how you handled Edward." Caroline sighed, finally letting the tension she had felt show. "He hates me, Henry." "He fears you," her husband corrected, "because he realizes what took me so long to see, that you are capable of transforming everything you touch." Henry approached, touching her face with a tenderness that still surprised her, even after months of closer coexistence. "I'm firing him tomorrow," he said, with the decisiveness of someone who admits no discussion. "I won't tolerate that kind of behavior." Caroline shook her head, holding his hand against her face. "No, Henry. If you fire him now, it will look like I'm hiding behind you, that I need you to protect me. That would only strengthen the rumors that I don't deserve my position." "But this is a battle I need to win for myself," Caroline insisted, with a determination that made Henry's eyes gleam with admiration. "In my own way." He nodded, respecting her decision, even if visibly displeased. "As you wish. But if the situation escalates, we'll deal with it together," she completed, sealing the promise with a kiss. In the following weeks, Caroline adopted a calculated strategy. Instead of confronting Charles Edward directly, she began to involve him more in projects, assigning him specific responsibilities that required detailed accountability. At the same time, she cultivated alliances with other managers and supervisors, demonstrating in practice how her innovations benefited everyone. The foreman, however, seemed determined to sabotage her efforts. During a joint inspection of a new experimental planting area, he made a point of contradicting all of Caroline's instructions in front of the workers, creating confusion among the team and undermining her authority. It was the last straw. That same afternoon, Caroline called a meeting with the entire ranch administrative team, including Charles Edward. Henry, who was on a business trip, would not be present, which, in fact, was perfect for her purposes. When everyone was gathered in the conference room, Caroline entered with a folder of documents and a serene expression that didn't betray the internal battle she was fighting against nervousness. "I thank you all for being here," she began, with a firm voice that surprised even those who already respected her. "I called this meeting because it's time for us to conduct an honest analysis of the situation at Alistair Ranch." For almost an hour, she presented meticulous data on productivity, costs, organizational climate, and expansion projects. The numbers spoke for themselves. Since she had taken over co-management with Henry, profits had increased significantly, employee turnover had decreased, and the ranch had gained national recognition for its innovative practices. "These results are the fruit of many people's work," she acknowledged, looking around the table. "Each of you contributed significantly to this growth. Except," her voice took on a graver tone, "else when you chose to sabotage instead of collaborate." A tense silence fell over the room. Everyone knew exactly whom she was referring to. "Mr. Vance," Caroline addressed Charles Edward directly, who stared at her with a mix of disdain and apprehension. "For months, I have tried to include you in the transformation process we are implementing. I offered opportunities, sought your expertise, respected your history on this ranch. In return, I received active resistance, deliberate sabotage, and public disrespect." She opened the folder and pulled out a set of documents. These are detailed records of each incident: equipment, mysteriously damaged, altered reports, contradicted instructions, along with dates, witnesses, and financial consequences for the ranch. Charles Edward's face paled. Clearly, He didn't expect such meticulous documentation. As Henry Allister's wife, I could simply demand your dismissal, Caroline continued, with a calculated coldness that recalled Henry himself in their early days together. But as co-administrator of this ranch, I prefer to offer choices. She slid the documents across the table to him. First option, you publicly acknowledge your actions, present a plan for how you intend to repair the damage caused, and commit to working constructively moving forward. Second option, you submit your resignation letter by the end of the day with standard benefits guaranteed. Third option, her voice dropped to an almost whisper, these documents are forwarded to the legal department for evaluation of possible lawsuits for material and moral damages. The entire room held its breath. No one, in all the years at Allister Ranch, had ever confronted Charles Edward Vance in that manner. Direct, documented, impeccable. The foreman looked around, searching for allies, but found only downcast eyes or neutral expressions. His network of influence, built over years, crumbled before the undeniable evidence of his sabotage. This is absurd, he tried, his voice betraying his nervousness. Mr. Henry would never allow. Mr. Henry fully trusts my judgment, Caroline cut in, with an authority that silenced the room. But if you prefer, we can await his return to discuss the matter. In the meantime, you will be temporarily relieved of your duties. It was the final blow. The prospect of spending days or weeks in professional limbo, while the rest of the ranch continued functioning without him, was more humiliation than his pride could bear. That same afternoon, Charles Edward left his resignation letter on Caroline's desk, along with the keys to the ranch vehicle and his access badge. He left without saying goodbye to anyone, a solitary figure carrying a box of belongings out the main gate. When Henry returned 3 days later, he found the ranch operating smoothly under Caroline's serene leadership. Upon being informed of the situation, his first instinct was concern. "Are you sure everything is all right? He didn't try anything against you?" Caroline smiled, touching her husband's worried face. "Everything is perfectly fine. In fact, several employees came to thank me." It seems Edward wasn't exactly popular among his subordinates. Henry observed her with a mix of pride and admiration. "You handled the situation better than I would have," he admitted, pulling her into a hug. "I probably would have lost my patience and created an unnecessary scandal." "I learned from the best," Caroline joked, referring to the strategic coldness she had both admired and feared in Henry at first. Only I added a touch of diplomacy. That night, as they rested on the porch observing the stars of the Texas Panhandle, Henry held Caroline's hand in his, contemplating the changes they had experienced in just over a year. "When I proposed that contract," he said, his voice low and reflective, "I thought I was acquiring a decorative wife, someone who would simply fill an empty space. I never imagined finding a partner, an equal." Caroline squeezed his hand, feeling the familiar warmth she now associated with security and genuine affection, no longer with power and intimidation. "And I thought I was selling my freedom to save my family. I never imagined I would find a different kind of freedom, that of truly being seen, valued for who I am, not for what I represent." Henry leaned in to kiss her, a slow and deep kiss that carried the story of their entire journey, from cold contract to genuine affection, from obligation to authentic desire, from control to partnership. When they separated, Caroline noticed a different sparkle in his eyes, a contained emotion that seemed about to overflow. "What is it?" she asked, caressing his face. Henry took a deep breath, like someone gathering courage for something important. "I love you, Caroline." It was the first time he had uttered those words. For months, he had expressed his affection in 1,000 different ways, with care, gestures, glances, touches. But the words, so simple and yet so complex for a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his life, had never been spoken. Caroline felt tears in her eyes. She didn't need to ask if he was sure, if it was true. The journey they had traveled together spoke for itself. "I love you too," she replied, with the simplicity of someone who finally finds the right name for a feeling that had grown slowly, transforming from fear into acceptance, from gratitude into admiration, from desire into true love. That night, the intimacy they shared had a different flavor. It was no longer a dance of bodies that knew each other, but the celebration of a union that transcended the physical. Every touch, every kiss, every whisper carried the weight of a story they had written together, against all odds. 2 weeks later, Caroline woke up feeling strangely nauseous. She initially attributed it to the previous night's dinner or a passing virus, but when the symptoms persisted for days, accompanied by unusual fatigue and a heightened sensitivity to certain smells, a suspicion began to form in her mind. Discreetly, she asked Mrs. Eleanor to buy a pregnancy test in town. The housekeeper, who now treated her with the respect and affection of someone who recognized a true lady of the house, returned with the request without asking questions, only with a look of maternal understanding. Caroline took the test alone, in the master bathroom, her heart beating so hard it felt like it wanted to escape her chest. When the 2 pink lines appeared in the test window, she sat on the marble floor, a wave of contradictory emotions washing over her all at once. Joy, fear, expectation and worry, all mixed in a whirlwind that left her momentarily breathless. A child, a new life, the fruit of a union that had begun as a cold contract and transformed into something so profound and true. How would Henry react? The original contract had never mentioned children. Would it be an unwanted complication for a man who valued control so much? Or would it be received as the natural continuation of the love they had built? She decided to wait for the right moment to tell him. That night, she prepared a special dinner, just the 2 of them, on the balcony that had become their favorite spot in the house. Candles, a bottle of red wine, from which she pretended to drink, discreetly swapping it for grape juice in her glass, and Henry's favorite food, prepared with her own hands, despite the cook's protests. Henry arrived home from work tired, but his face lit up when he saw the romantic setting. After dinner, as they sat side by side contemplating the stars, Caroline finally gathered her courage. "I have something to tell you," she said, her voice slightly trembling. Henry turned to her, his expression softening as he noticed her nervousness. "What is it? Has something happened?" Caroline took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "Do you remember our initial contract?" A shadow of confusion crossed his face. "Of course, but I thought we had already moved past that phase." "And we have," she assured him, holding his hands. "But that contract had specific terms, clear obligations. And now?" She hesitated, her heart racing. "Now we have a new, unforeseen clause." Henry frowned, clearly not understanding what she was getting at. "Caroline, please be direct. You're worrying me." She led his hand to her still flat belly, her eyes fixed on his. "I'm pregnant, Henry. We're going to have a child." For a moment that seemed eternal. Henry remained absolutely still, his eyes wide, fixed on her face, his hand still on her belly. Caroline felt fear grow. Had she made a mistake? Was it too soon? Did he not want children? Then, something extraordinary happened. Henry's eyes, always so controlled, filled with tears. His face, usually a mask of composure, transformed into an expression of pure emotion. Joy, astonishment, fear, all mixed together. "A child," he whispered, his voice choked. "Our child." Caroline nodded, her own tears now flowing freely. Our child, what followed, would forever be etched in Caroline's memory as one of the most precious moments of her life. Henry fell to his knees before her, embracing her waist, his face pressed against her belly in a gesture of reverence she would never have expected from the powerful businessman she had known a year ago. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice muffled by emotion, "for everything you've taught me, for everything you've given me, for this new life." When he finally raised his face, there was a sparkle in his eyes that Caroline had never seen before, a mixture of absolute vulnerability and fierce determination. "I will be a different father than I had," he promised, with the solemnity of an oath. "Our child will know love from day one, will feel pride without pressure, will have support without demands." Caroline caressed his hair, her heart overflowing with love. "We will be parents together, Henry. We will learn together, as we have done with everything else." The news of the pregnancy brought a new aura to Alistair Ranch. Henry, to the surprise of all who knew him only as the ruthless businessman, became almost obsessive in his care for Caroline. He hired the best obstetrician from Dallas, who traveled regularly to the ranch for consultations. He installed emergency medical equipment. He read dozens of books on pregnancy and child development. Caroline watched this transformation with a mix of amusement and tenderness. The man who had once planned every aspect of his life with calculating precision now completely surrendered to the mystery of fatherhood with an almost childlike enthusiasm. "Do you think it will be a boy or a girl?" he constantly asked, even knowing it was too early for any prediction. "I think it will be healthy and loved," Caroline replied, avoiding specific expectations. "That's all that matters." When her belly began to grow, Henry developed the habit of talking to the baby before sleep, telling stories about the ranch, about the horses he or she would learn to ride, about the stars they would gaze at together on the balcony. Caroline watched these intimate conversations with a full heart, amazed by the transformation of the man she had known. The baby's room became a special project. Henry insisted on participating in every detail, from the choice of the crib to the color of the walls, a soft yellow that would suit both a boy and a girl. Local artisans were hired to create custom furniture, unique pieces that told the story of the region. In the 5th month of gestation, during the ultrasound that would finally reveal the baby's sex, Henry held Caroline's hand so tightly that she joked she would need it intact to care for the child. The doctor smiled as he announced, "Congratulations, it's a girl." Silent tears streamed down Henry's face, a man who, until he met Caroline, rarely showed any emotion. That night, as they contemplated the stars on the balcony, they discussed names. "I want something that symbolizes what she represents to us," Henry said, caressing Caroline's already prominent belly. "Something that carries meaning." "How about hope?" Caroline suggested, thinking of everything they had experienced. "It was what initially united us, my hope to save my family, your hope to build something more meaningful than a business empire." Henry considered the name, testing it aloud. "Hope Alistair Miller," he said, with a smile of approval. "It's perfect." Hope's birth transformed Alistair Ranch in ways no one could have predicted. The main house, once a formal and sometimes austere environment, filled with colors, sounds, and a vibrant energy that infected even the most stoic employees. Henry George, to the shock of his business associates, drastically reduced his workload in the first few months. He delegated responsibilities, restructured departments, and reorganized meetings, all to spend more time with his newborn daughter. "The empire won't crumble if I dedicate a few hours a day to my family," he declared, when a partner questioned his new priorities. "In fact, I've never been more motivated to ensure everything runs perfectly." Caroline observed this transformation with joy and admiration. The man who once proposed a marriage by contract, cold and calculating, now rocked his daughter in the early hours so she could rest, sang lullabies with his deep voice, and photographed every small moment as if it were an invaluable treasure. Caroline's father, now recovered and dividing his time between the small homestead in Amarillo and frequent visits to the ranch, couldn't hide his astonishment at his son-in-law's transformation. "If someone had told me a year ago that Henry Alistair would be this kind of father, I would have laughed at the joke," he commented to his daughter, as they watched Henry proudly showing little hope the ranch horses, even knowing she was too young to understand. "People change, father," Caroline replied, with a serene smile, "when they find sufficiently powerful reasons to do so." When Hope turned 2, Caroline discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the news was met with immediate celebration, no fears, no hesitations, just the pure joy of expanding the family they had built together. "A little brother for Hope," Henry said, embracing her with tenderness. "Our family is growing." The second baby, a boy, was born on a rainy night, a rare and celebrated event in the plains. He was named Anthony, in honor of Caroline's father, creating a symbolic bridge between the humble origins she had never forgotten and the prosperous future they were building together. Alistair Ranch, now widely recognized for its innovative and sustainable practices, became more than a business. It was the home of a family that had defied all odds. The main house, once a symbol of power and isolation, transformed into a living space where children's laughter echoed through the previously silent corridors, where dinners brought together staff and family in celebrations that dissolved old social barriers. The library, which had once been Caroline's solitary refuge, now housed a new generation of readers. Henry was often found there, with Hope on his lap, reading stories of brave princesses and gentle knights who saved kingdoms not with strength, but with wisdom and compassion. One quiet afternoon, as they watched the children playing under the shade of an ancient oak tree, Henry held Caroline's hand in his gaze contemplative. "Sometimes I think of that phrase I said at the beginning," he commented, his voice low and reflective. "You will marry me and learn to make love. What arrogance of mine." Caroline smiled, intertwining her fingers with his. "In the end, I was the one who truly learned," Henry continued. "I learned that to love is not to possess, control, or dominate. It is to free, to accept, to grow together." "We learned together," Caroline corrected, leaning in for a soft kiss, "as we promised that morning on the porch of my parents' home." The old phrase that had started everything, "You will marry me and learn to make love," had ceased to be an order, an imposition. It had transformed into a symbol of the extraordinary journey they had traveled, from contract to commitment, from obligation to desire, from fear to trust, from loneliness to family. On the horizon, the sun began to set over the plains, painting the sky with intense shades of orange and red. Hope ran in circles, chasing butterflies, while little Anthony took his first uncertain steps on the grass. Henry embraced Caroline from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder as they contemplated the perfect scene before them. Not just a family, but a legacy of transformation. "Of all the deals I've ever made," he whispered in her ear, "that contract was, without a doubt, the best investment of my life." Caroline smiled, leaning back against the strong chest that now represented not power or intimidation, but security and genuine affection. "And of all the decisions I've made," she replied, "signing that paper was the one that freed me the most." The plains around them, silent witness to their story, began to light their first stars. The property that had once been merely a business empire transformed into the setting of a true love story, born not of fairy tales or instant passions, but of daily choices, constant overcoming, and the courage to tear down walls to build bridges. As the children's laughter echoed across the property, Caroline and Henry remained embraced, contemplating not only the past that had united them against all odds, but the future they were building together. A future where contracts gave way to commitments, where power yielded space to love, and where two people from completely different worlds discovered, day after day, that the greatest transformations begin in the most improbable places. In the desert of obligation, the oasis of true love had been born, not an instant miracle, but a patient construction, watered with tears, strengthened by storms, and celebrated, now, under the starry sky of the American plains that had witnessed every step of that improbable journey of transformation.